Good afternoon and welcome to today's virtual seminar. The Atlantic 10's Commission on Racial Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion is a really important commission. This is a cornerstone event being co-hosted by not only the Atlantic 10 Conference, but Duquesne University. Our co-chairs, President Gormley from Duquesne University and Brian Baptiste, Athletic Director at LaSalle University, have done phenomenal work in leading our commission throughout the course of the last 3 years. Today's session will be presented to you by Claude Johnson. Claude is the author and the executive director of the Black Fives. I think you'll find the information that Claude's going to present not only extremely interesting, but tremendously educational. So a special thank you to you, Claude, for spending time with our Atlantic 10 constituents in today's seminar. I'm going to turn it over to President Gormley for your remarks.
Thanks, Commissioner McGlade. Good afternoon. My name is Ken Gormley. I'm privileged to serve as president of Duquesne University and as co-chair of the A10 Commission on Racial Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion. I'm thrilled that so many of you could join us today, and I'm extremely proud to serve as the co-chair of the commission, along with Brian Baptiste, Vice President of Athletics and Recreation at LaSalle University. This initiative marks a crucial step forward as we work to ensure that our sports teams and staff, our campuses, and society as a whole foster respect for diversity and work to advance equity and inclusion in all aspects of our lives at our academic institutions, which, after all, serve as the places where society's leaders of tomorrow are being produced. We're broadcasting live today from our studio at Duquesne University in Pittsburgh, but I'm happy to have my co-chair, Brian Baptiste, join us remotely from LaSalle University in Philadelphia. Brian, welcome to the show.
Thanks, Ken. It's great to be here today to discuss some important history, enlighten all of us on the many strides that have been made throughout college basketball's rich history. Claude Johnson's research into the lives of these young men and women who were athletes more than a century ago reminds us that we're making a difference every day as we work toward diversity, equity, and inclusion on all of our campuses and throughout our greater communities. I've been looking forward to this discussion, and I know all of our university students, colleagues, and alums will find this to be a fascinating program. Thanks to Duquesne for hosting such a special event.
Thanks, Brian. It's a great honor to serve with you on this important initiative of the A10. This is a very special collaboration. The A10 is one of the most prominent athletic conferences in the United States. It consists of 15 members: Davidson College, University of Dayton, Duquesne University, Fordham University, George Mason, the George Washington University, LaSalle, Loyola Chicago, the University of Massachusetts, University of Rhode Island, University of Richmond, St. Bonaventure, St. Joe's University, St. Louis, and Virginia Commonwealth University. All great institutions. And today's program, a special feature in honor of Black History Month, is the third in a series of conversations sponsored by the A10. We're thrilled to host a conversation today about the long overlooked history and impact of African American basketball prior to the formation of the NBA in 1949 that really led the way, set the stage for the creation of basketball as a professional sport in the United States. We're especially honored to have with us today the author of a groundbreaking new book that gives us an in-depth look at those early pioneers in basketball. We're so pleased to welcome author and historian Claude Johnson, whose book, The Black Fives, The Epic Story of Basketball's Forgotten Era, is garnering national acclaim. It's fitting, I think, to have this conversation in Pittsburgh because, like the home cities of so many of our A10 schools, African American basketball teams really took off in Pittsburgh and many of the cities that make up the A10. Before I introduce our special guest here, I want to be sure to mention that we'll take audience questions after our discussion, so be sure to submit them. You can submit them anytime by clicking on the link that appears in the description below the video on the YouTube page where you're viewing this program. And now it's my honor to introduce historian Claude Johnson. Claude is the founder of Black Fives Foundation, whose mission is to research, preserve, showcase, teach, and honor the pre-NBA history of African Americans in basketball. Claude holds a bachelor's degree in civil engineering and economics from Carnegie Mellon University right here in Pittsburgh. He went on to earn his master's degree in mechanical engineering from Stanford University. During a 20-year career in corporate America, Claude held management and executive positions at IBM, American Express, NBA Properties, Nike, Phat Farm, and Benetton Sports System. He went on to serve in another important role, stay-at-home dad for his 3 student-athlete sons. Claude lives in Greenwich, Connecticut. He spent years working on this path-breaking new book about the largely overlooked story of the Black Fives and their contribution to professional basketball, both men's and women's, and to professional sports in the United States. Please join me in welcoming Mr. Claude Johnson.
Thank you so much. Thank you to the A10, Duquesne University, and you, Ken, to have me here as a guest. It's a real honor.
Well, let's start off, Claude. Tell us a little bit about how this book came about, and what made you write it.
Well, I was working at the NBA, and they were celebrating what they called their 50th anniversary, and there was an 800-page book about the NBA Encyclopedia of Basketball, but it only included 3 pages. But I knew there were more because Arthur Ashe had written a book on this whole history of African Americans in sport. And some of those teams really intrigued me, and that started me on my quest to find out, well, how come we don't know about this, and where can I find out? And I even had to learn how to research.
So 3 pages out of 800 in the history of the NBA about Black basketball. Well, you've made up for it with this fabulous, I mean, it's a good read, it's a fabulous book. So let's turn it over to Brian to ask you a question.
So Claude, who exactly are the Black Fives? Like, where did the name come from, and during what time period did they play? And then I want you to spend a little bit of time talking to us about the individuals that you describe as kings and fathers of Black basketball in America, such as Will Anthony Madden, who's on the cover of the book as well.
Yeah, and I mean, it's a 480-page book. That's what Ken's referring to, and it's got 1,300 footnotes, but yet it's a narrative nonfiction, which means we're taking these pioneers and humanizing them. So they weren't just statistics. I wanted to find out, well, who were they as people? What did their parents do? What was going on in society during this time? So it turns out that African Americans have been playing basketball since about 1904. And up until the NBA signed its first 3 players in 1950, I just started calling that period the Black Fives era. Fives because of the 5 starting players.
Yeah.
And the Black Fives were these early pioneers, both men and women. And so this is a book about that whole history. It spans a great deal of time, really from the 1800s into the 1970s, actually.
Yeah, really remarkable that it takes us to 2022-23 for a book on this period of history to come to light. That's why we want to feature it for our A10 Commission on Racial Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion. It's a remarkable story. So tell us a little bit about what role the cities that are now home to A10 teams, specifically not just Pittsburgh, but DC, Philly, New York City, Dayton, Chicago, and others, across pretty much every team in this league. How do they play a role in the development of African American basketball teams? And equally as important, Claude, how did these teams play an important role in the Black social scene at that time? That's one of the great parts of this story.
Yeah, I mean, I focus on DC, New York City, Chicago, and Pittsburgh, but really the development of African American basketball, and that's why it's so appropriate for the A10 to be involved in presenting this history, is that all of the schools overlapped with the footprint of Black basketball. Teams like the New York Rens, which is this jacket that I'm wearing, the Renaissance, they toured everywhere. They toured to St. Louis, they came to the South, North Carolina, they went to Virginia, they went to Chicago, all the footprints that you named. And it was important because this was a way of African American culture saying we have something as well that we can contribute. And they actually dominated for most of the time, most of the games, 85% of their games, they played about 150 games a season for a 25-year
for
period.
our student athletes, 155 games a season, just saying.
Yeah,
Because,
yeah.
These were hard-working athletes.
And they didn't have ice baths and first class and all that. But what was important about it is that they helped spread popularity of the game to remote places. And that's important because those teams in those locales had to up their game. They had to escalate and become better in order to beat the New York Reds.
So even when they were playing in totally white cities and states, they were going in and playing these teams, and then they actually socialized together at the end, right?
Well, what they did is they had to have some kind of a deal, right? Because the New York Reds, as an example, but there were other barnstorming clubs, would go to a remote place that's predominantly white, beat that local team, leave safely, come and get invited back. And that's because they were like a mobile economic stimulus that was bringing people from miles around during the Great Depression, during Jim Crow, and everybody was a winner. And that's why they kept getting invited back, and that's why those local teams got better.
Yeah, Brian, you want to jump in there?
Yeah, so this jumps into my question, right? When you think about how did these barnstorming teams really cause black basketball to catch fire in the early 1900s? And then I also, I'm sure through some of your response, there are going to be harrowing stories that they experienced as these basketball pioneers. Can you touch on one of those stories that deeply moved you through your research?
Yeah, I mean, what happened at the beginning, basketball was actually introduced as a community wellness tool. It was because early on, cities were congested because there were so many migrants from the South who were escaping the oppression that they started overcrowding places like New York City, and there was an onslaught of pneumonia, tuberculosis, and some of the places where they lived didn't even have ventilation, and so people didn't realize it was contagious. They just thought we need to exercise our lungs. So in the very beginning, social clubs, athletic clubs started introducing basketball. And it just kept spreading. There were 100 spectators, and then it grew to 1,000 and 3,000 and more. And then they started barnstorming, and as Brian was saying, they started going out to remote places like the Pacific Northwest. And then you start to see, in my research, I came across a team, the New York Harlemites, who were from St. Louis, actually, and they traveled up to the Pacific Northwest in 1937 and encountered a blizzard. Now, they had a schedule in a series of games, but this blizzard, that week, the temperatures reached minus 40 degrees in Montana, and their car broke down. So they had to walk 3 miles, and eventually were rescued by a sheep herder who brought them into his hut, and they had to be hospitalized. So they were treated for frostbite, severe frostbite. Their hands were bandaged, and then they kept playing in the next game that they were scheduled, and they beat that team by 1 point with bandaged hands. And I knew that because it was written in the newspapers. But one of their teammates had such severe frostbite, Ken, that he had to be sent home, and he developed gangrene. And the only treatment for gangrene is amputation. And his mom refused to have his limbs amputated, so he died.
Wow.
The newspaper said the boys played really well despite the loss of their teammate who died of gangrene last week. And so it shows that it was about more than just the game. It really had to do with, we have to make sure we pave the way so that other black teams get invited if we don't continue our schedule, because people are waiting for us to show up.
Yeah.
And it was about more than the game. It was also about race and uplift and improvement. It wasn't for the money. It was because they're trying to do something bigger than basketball.
Yeah, incredible. I think, Brian, you had another one?
Yeah, I do. I mean, that's an incredible story, and you can see the popularity continue to grow. Can you talk to us about which teams were the best of that era and why?
Well, I'm wearing the New York Rens jacket because the Rens were formed 100 years ago in 1923. And the owner of this team that was in New York City needed a home court because Prohibition had made the rentals of other facilities skyrocket. So he approached the owner of a place called the Renaissance Casino in Harlem. And they came to an agreement that if they changed their name to the Renaissance, then they could use the facility. And their nickname became the Wrens. And so from 1923 till they dissolved in 1949, as I mentioned, they played upwards of 150 games a season and won more than 85% of those games against all the best teams. And that's an incredible record, considering that you had to ride around in a bus, weren't allowed in certain facilities or certain places for restaurants or accommodations. And you had sometimes 2 games per day. In 1933, they won 88 straight games, which was a pro record at the time, in 86 days.
Wow.
So it just meant you had to be nonstop. And again, this was before you had amazing footwear and other gear and orthopedics and surgeons and things like that. You just kept playing. And so this was really grueling, but it was also, they were famous and they were uplifting and inspirational to thousands and hundreds of thousands of people.
And the Harlem Globetrotters came into existence then, and teams in Pittsburgh, right? I mean, these teams were blossoming.
Yes, yes. The Globetrotters were formed 4 years after the Renaissance, and they also took off and they started touring around. Teams from Pittsburgh started touring around. There were some amazing pioneers that I talk about from Pittsburgh, including Cumberland Posey Jr. And I think that once you start reading this history, you realize this was the genesis of the game. This was how this all began. I try to go back to the very beginning of why even basketball was invented in the first place. What was it trying to address, not only in the Black community, but throughout culture in general? And so I think that that's one of the key takeaways from this book.
Yeah, and you mentioned Cumberland Posey. So, as you know, I had a chance to sit down and talk with his great nephew last week just for this program. So I'd like to now watch together this brief video. We're here today with Dr. Evan Baker at his office at UPMC Mercy Hospital, where he's a surgical pathologist. Evan is a Pittsburgh resident with deep roots in this city. His great uncle, Cumberland Posey, was one of the kings and fathers of basketball profiled in Claude Johnson's book that we're featuring in our program today. And up until this history was assembled in the Black Fives book, Cumberland Posey was best known for playing on, managing, and ultimately owning one of the most successful dynasties in professional baseball history, which was the premier team of the Negro National League, the Homestead Grays, right here in Pittsburgh. But now we learn from Claude's amazing book that he was also, Cumberland Posey, an architect of the Black Fives basketball era. And in fact, he was a star athlete in many sports, baseball, basketball. He played, and we can ask you about this, Evan, but he played for the Duquesne Dukes for a period of time. Here he is. So, Evan, we're privileged to have you join us for this special A10 broadcast today in honor of Black History Month. So let's start by just telling us a little bit about the legacy of your great uncle, Cumberland "Cum" Posey. Tell us a little bit about his background.
Sure, Ken. Thanks for having me. Cum was actually born in Homestead. His father was a riverboat captain who built steam engines and brought coal from the coal mining centers down to the Carnegie Steelworks in Homestead, and was a business partner of Andrew Carnegie. And
had been the child of slaves, was it?
Yes, his parents, he was referred to, Cum's father, as Cap. Cap's parents were slaves in Virginia.
So tell us a little bit about the baseball piece of things, because that is what he's most well known for.
Certainly. He began playing for a team which was a precursor of the Homestead Grays, and continued as a player when they became the Grays. And subsequently went beyond his playing prowess to become the manager of the team and eventually the owner of the team. And the team had tremendous success throughout the 1930s and 1940s. Some of the greatest baseball players of all time played for the Grays. He kind of managed all that, and because of his success in running the team and actually being an administrator and de facto commissioner for the Negro Leagues, was inducted into the National Baseball Hall of Fame.
Now tell us a little bit about Cumberland Posey's lesser-known role as a pioneer of the Black Fives era that we're talking about today, which predated the NBA.
Yes. So prior to his baseball career, if you will, he was a championship basketball player. He began playing in Homestead, and subsequently he went on to play at Penn State for a time, and then after that, actually using an alias, played for Duquesne University.
Switched his name around a little bit.
So he kind of predated the transfer portal, if you will.
Where he was a star, but he ended up being truly one of the premier players. But he wasn't a tall guy, was he?
No, he was not. He was a guard. He very athletic. He had a lot of speed and agility, and I think there's the most important part of his basketball game was his ability to shoot the outside shot. I guess a precursor to the tremendous three-point shooters we have now, like Steph Curry et al. He shot from areas outside and kind of changed the game, forcing the defenders to come out and cover him.
And was viewed as probably the best basketball player in the 1920s in the United States.
Yeah, following his time at Penn State and Duquesne, he played on the Black Fives era teams here in Pittsburgh. First, the Lewendai Club, which was based here, actually where we are now in the Hill District, and later with the Monticello team.
Yeah.
It's really, I think, a feather in the cap of our city that it played a prominent role in both the Negro Leagues in baseball and the Black Fives era in basketball.
And of course, Chuck Cooper, who played for Duquesne in 1950, becomes the first black player to play for the NBA when he's drafted by the Boston Celtics. But in the end, your great uncle did get the recognition that he deserved, not in his lifetime, for sure, but he is now in both the Baseball and the Basketball Hall of Fame. Does anyone else have that distinction?
No, he is actually the only person who's in both of those, and I was fortunate to be at both of those enshrinement ceremonies, and it's a wonderful thing that gives me a great sense of pride. I sort of feel bad in a way because I feel like I've been to several of these Hall of Fame ceremonies, and obviously he was not there, but I'm sure was there in spirit, and our entire family is extraordinarily proud of all of his accomplishments, and blessed that he's been recognized for those accomplishments.
Yeah, and as a proud family member, what would you say is his most important legacy?
Well, that's an interesting question. Certainly, his athletic prowess in two sports is phenomenal. But I think actually the fact that he was able to transcend just the physical and athletic part of it and become involved in the administrative and business side of both sports is his enduring legacy in my mind. He showed that you can be more than just the guy that puts the ball on the hoop.
So, Claude, that really kind of gives me goosebumps even, to have a chance to hear this history from someone who is a direct relative, lived right next door to where Cumberland Posey lived. And I know he and other members of the Posey family have been important resources for you in researching the book. What makes Cumberland Posey so special to you as a writer of history?
Well, Evan mentioned it. Part of it is that he had this grit and determination that he learned in the sandlots of Pittsburgh, and but part of it was also that he had this vision for where basketball could go. He became an entrepreneur, and that came out not only as the architect of the Negro National League in baseball with the Homestead Grays, but also in basketball, where he started forming these teams, and he was a master of the PR behind it and getting the local newspapers to write about it. His father was one of the co-founders of the Low-End-I Social and Literary Club in Pittsburgh, which was the most exclusive black social club in the country. And so that's how they got that name. And when they toured around, they were really famous, and he was famous.
And his father was editor of the Pittsburgh Courier, which was the most famous black newspaper in the United States. And so they,
Yes.
in fact, he wrote a column for the Cumberland Posey did. But it's just such great history. I dug out of the archives to show Claude a picture of Cumberland Posey playing baseball for the Duquesne
Yes.
team. And then here he is, as we saw, playing basketball for the Duquesne team, and ends up going into the Hall of Fame for both sports. Really the Patrick Mahomes of his era 100 years earlier. He was also the captain of the golf team here.
Right.
So this guy did it all. But let me ask you, talking about doing it all, what about women's teams as part of this era? When and how did these evolve?
So women's teams were there from the very beginning, Ken. So the tradition was that the men's teams, especially the club teams, would have a sister team. And they were often coached by one of the players on the men's team. And the women were then also got involved in helping with the socializing after games on the men's side, decorating and entertaining. But at the same time, the men then, when it was their turn, did that for the women's games.
Incredible.
And so they supported each other, because after all, if you're hosting a game, it's more than just the concept of playing and leave. Hosting meant you literally were responsible for putting them up in a hotel, the meals, the reception after the game. That was a really important part of it. Win or lose, both the men and the sister team, or vice versa, would entertain and host the opponent.
Yeah, really, we were talking about that after lunch. Really incredible to think of it today, that after the game, everyone would get together in these cities wherever they were traveling, and win or lose, you got together and socialized afterwards. Incredible.
Because you have to realize, and people may not know this, but there were very few people had phones. There definitely wasn't an internet. So this was social networking. You wanted to find out what was going on in Washington or Chicago or Pittsburgh if you were in New York City, and the only way to do that was at such an event. And they also had music and other things that were incorporated into that.
Yeah, and I see
effort.
Brian has a question here for us.
Yeah, so Claude, can you talk to us, how did black basketball and the ultimate integration of black players in the NBA in the early 1950s, how did that represent an important factor in the evolution of professional sports, and even greater than that, in American society itself?
So interestingly, the early teams of the Black Fives era were playing against white teams on a routine basis before 1910. And this was just common at that time. They didn't mix teams necessarily, but the teams like the Smart Set Athletic Club in Brooklyn would play against their white opponents. And that then led to just this being normalized, honestly, even into the 1920s. And eventually, when the New York Rens were formed, they were the first all-black, black-owned, fully professional basketball team. And they were touring, so those 150 games I mentioned, most of those were on the road. They only played a small portion of those games at home at that original Renaissance casino, because it only held a certain number of people. And so the games that they played, the majority of them were against white teams. And this was starting in the 20s and 30s and so on. Eventually they played more and more HBCU teams, but for the most part, a large percentage of their schedule was against white teams. So when the league finally signed its first black players, everybody already knew that African American talent was the best in the country.
Yeah, and as you know, Chuck Cooper, Duquesne basketball star, was the first black player drafted by the NBA by the Boston Celtics in 1950, something we're proud of. We now play in the UPMC Cooper Fieldhouse
Yes.
to honor his legacy. How does he figure into this whole story?
He was a major figure because he, first of all, made a name for himself at Duquesne. And, the coach was Chick Davies, who grew up, ironically, on the same street as a neighbor of Cumberland Posey in Homestead. And he played on an all-Jewish team that played against those teams. It was called the Second Story Mories. And so now you fast forward, and he's the coach, an NIT coach, took them to the NIT finals in the 1940s. And Chuck Cooper was from Westinghouse, so he was a homegrown talent at Westinghouse High School here in the city. And for him to be elevated to the point of being drafted was really incredible. It was really it was as special as Joe Louis winning the championship and beating Max Schmeling, or Jack Johnson winning the heavyweight championship in black culture, because it meant, okay, we've arrived. Black people already knew that we had arrived because of the success of the Renaissance, the Wrens. But this was something else because it meant that the NBA was going to be racially integrated as well in 1950.
Yeah, let's go to Brian for a final question, then we'll start moving into some audience questions. This is fascinating stuff.
Claude, one of the things that you've said in interviews, when writing this book, was in part that you were giving voice to the voiceless. Can you just spend some time in depth talking about what did that mean? What did you mean by that?
Yeah, that's a great question, and thank you, Brian. And what it means is that over time, I've developed a sense of the hidden stories of these people. On the cover is a man named Will Anthony Madden, who started out in poverty in New York City, in Greenwich Village, which then was called Little Africa because there were so many black people living there, most of the black folks in the city, around 1880s. He eventually became the king of black basketball in the 1910s, but by the time he died in the 1970s, he was buried in an unmarked grave. And so then I thought, well, this whole history is buried in an unmarked grave. And who's speaking for these people that were in the headlines, and now all of a sudden they disappeared, they're forgotten? And as a human, as a person, we've all had experiences where we we feel like maybe our voices aren't being heard. Everybody's had that. And so I have great empathy for giving voice to the voiceless, whether that's kids, whether that's people who are forgotten, whether that's underrepresented, underserved, even today.
Yeah, incredible.
Well, Claude, we appreciate you doing that, and certainly want to encourage as many people as possible to be able to purchase the book. So before we go to the audience questions, I want to make sure that everyone knows where they can purchase a copy of Claude's book. So there are two places, including Duquesne University bookstore, which has made sure to have numerous copies in stock. And you can also order the book on bookshop.org. Let me say that again, bookshop.org, which in turn gives revenue to your closest local independent community bookstore. You will be able to see both of the links on the screen and also in the description of the YouTube where you're viewing this program today. So I encourage you all to really buy the book, learn about the history, because it's tremendous research that you did, Claude.
Yeah,
Thank
and
you.
incidentally, we got copies of the book, as you know, Brian, for every member of our A10 commission on racial equity, diversity and inclusion, because we think it is such a meaningful, it really is, a groundbreaking piece of history, something that all, not just student athletes, but all students of history of any kind should be reading. And so I really encourage you all to get it. But let's get to some audience questions from our viewers joining us by live stream. So if you haven't done this already, those of you who are joining us by live stream, and incidentally, I know we have not only individual people, but at all of our 15 campuses of the A10, we have watch parties going on here, Claude. So we have here at Duquesne and our campus, big groups of students watching together. I know the same is at Brian's school at LaSalle and all of the campuses. I was just on a Zoom call with all of the A10 presidents this morning, and they were all really enthusiastic about this. So any of you watching, if you haven't done this already, just submit your questions by clicking on the link that appears at the bottom of your YouTube page where you're viewing this program. So I'm going to go to the first question that was submitted. And this is actually a great question. How did the game itself come about? You know, the creation of positions, you know, names such as forward, the rule of the basket being 10 feet off the ground. Where did all of that come from?
Yeah, so thank you for that question. One of the things that happens when you write a history book this deep is that I started doing research on the actual game itself. How was it invented? What were the rules that were different back then? And what was the equipment even that took place? And so we look at the basket. So when James Naismith nailed his peach basket to the wall in the YMCA, that explains why the rim is 10 feet off the floor. It's because the running track in those vintage YMCA's is exactly 10 feet off the floor. And then the basket at that time was originally a peach basket. So the early baskets didn't have an opening at the bottom. The referee had to, after each made field goal, tip that receptacle over, and then there was a center jump at mid-court after each made basket.
Wow.
So the game was very slow. These early games were, 10-7 or 21-18, but eventually they speeded up because they did away with that rule. There was another rule where if the ball went out of bounds, possession went to the team that got to it first. So it was actually dangerous to be a spectator, and that's why they put the game into a cage. And so early basketball players were known as cagers because they were in this cage that was a wire mesh cage. It was to protect the audience, but eventually it was also to protect the players because the fans would have a cigar or a hat pin or some other way to inject themselves into the game, literally. And so that was important. And there was there were other things, like the ball had laces.
Yeah,
and
saw that in the pictures.
Yeah, there was no needle hole. So you had to unlace the ball, take out the bladder and inflate it by lung pressure till it was the right pressure, fold that back over and re-sew it and see if it bounce tested properly. And if it didn't, you had to start the whole process over again. So there were a lot of these types of things that happened. And even the early positions, I started wondering, why are you called a guard and a forward? Because I came across a graphic where you have the left guard and the right guard, and they were responsible for defending the basket as the guards.
Wow, like soccer almost.
Like soccer almost. And then you had, once they got the rebound, they would pass it forward, up court to the forward. And there was a left forward and a right forward. The center was important because if you got possession of the jump ball, you literally almost could score until the other team may not ever get possession of the ball if you had the leaping ability. So the center was responsible for getting possession, and then you just kept playing. So I started going into all these, even why is a jersey called a jersey? And the answer to that is that early jerseys were made using a certain knit that was innovated in the English Channel on an island called the Isle of Jersey. So
Wow,
there was
amazing.
a mill there,
Huh.
and they started calling it the jersey knit. And so these shirts that were worn by basketball players to wick sweat were called jersey knit tops, but eventually they were just called jerseys.
Incredible stuff. And one of the other fun things, just so our audience has a visual, so they're playing on these little courts, but they were little because they were also doubled as dance floors. So this was integrated into the social aspect of things. There was church on the weekends, and then there would be these social gatherings in the black community. And inevitably, there were dances before, during, or after these things where everyone got together, right? On that same floor.
On that same floor, because around 1910, the radio and the phonograph became commercially available. And so prior to that, the only way you could really listen to music was if you had a piano in your parlor or in a saloon. And when people started hearing this music, especially ragtime, which was indigenous to African American culture, they wanted to dance to this music. So then you needed a ballroom. So they started building ballrooms. And then these ballrooms were sometimes empty on off nights. And so enterprising black basketball promoters said, hey, wait a minute, let's get an African-American orchestra, a ragtime orchestra, play before the game as patrons are coming in, play during halftime, and play afterwards. And since they're playing afterwards, let's turn it into a dance. So all those early advertisements, I found out, would say basketball, which was 2 words, basketball and dance. And so that I found really fascinating because it meant that these games became meaningful social events.
Yeah, that's great. We'll have to ask Commissioner McGlade if we could have a dance at the end of the A10 tournament, Brian. That would be a lot of fun. It's just a fabulous history. Why don't you give us a question from the audience, Brian?
Yeah, I do have one. I think some of the comments that you just answered to that first question provoked this question. So this is, what were some of the most surprising discoveries you made in terms of history that was previously unknown? So I just learned a bunch of stuff, right, from reading this book and your answer. But I think the audience member wants to know, what is the most surprising discovery?
I was really surprised by the fact that there some of these newspapers that existed back then, early African-American newspapers like the Pittsburgh Courier, which you talked about. There's missing chunks of records of those papers. They weren't digitized, or they were burned in a fire, or some other reason. But through research, I was looking in a totally unexpected place, which was actually the New York State Supreme Court docket, and one of the depositions that had evidence, which was actually newspaper clippings from a missing chunk of the Amsterdam News that people never thought existed. But in those clippings, it talked about Will Anthony Madden, who was saying that he wanted to form an all-black league. And this was as early as the 1910s, in 1914. Nobody ever knew that before. So now we're talking about having an African-American basketball league as early as the 1910s, which is remarkable. A man way ahead of his time who, once you read about his contributions, you'll see that he's a definite candidate for the Basketball Hall of Fame.
Wow, incredible. And that makes me think, actually, it may be good for our student viewers, in particular our student athletes, but all students watching this. You were telling me a little bit about lunch. You were not a trained writer. That wasn't necessarily your forte in school, and yet you developed the art form to create this magnificent book. Why don't you say a little bit about that?
Ken is saying, so I admitted that when I was in junior high school, I got straight D's in English. I really did. And so some of it was overcoming, lack of confidence. But we have these signs around our house that say stoppable ? Or unstoppable ? And I think that's really important. And it leads into also our slogan, which is Make History Now, as you know. And at the end of the day, I just was so passionate about this history and giving voice to it that I just had to keep going. What I had to learn was, what is my voice? Like, what's my own voice? Because you're giving voice to the voiceless, including yourself. And so anybody who's ever written, you have to sort of get a feel for it and then learn how to turn facts into stories and to actually do the storytelling. And so that was an important part of this. And then I had to put it on the shelf because of kids and being a dad, and they were all student athletes. So sometimes I had to write this, 2 minutes at a time. But what I think is important is that what people can learn from this is it's like a basketball train. And if you look out the window at the scenery, you'll see Black history. You'll see American history while this is all going on. So I put it into the context, because you can't really know about why the cities were congested unless you know why African Americans were leaving the South, and all the things that go with that.
Yeah.
Can I have a
Yeah, Brian,
have a great
go
question.
with another question. We'll start. Yeah, we still have a little time here.
Yeah, I have a great question from the audience. Claude, what players would you select for the Black Fives all-time team?
Ooh, that's a tough one.
We're making a dream team, a Black Fives dream team. So
That's
we
a
gotta pick
great
5
question. That's a great question. I mean, you have to put Cumberland Posey on there. Innovated the long distance shot and other ways of winning. You have to put a man named Clarence Fats Jenkins on there. He was the first captain of that Wren's team that was formed in 1923. He played in 4 different decades and as the captain of that team. You probably then have to put Tarzan Cooper, Charles Tarzan Cooper, who was a center on that team that won 33 straight games. And then then it becomes a question mark because there were so many fantastic players, both on the Globetrotters, on the Wrens, and on other African-American teams that excelled during this time. And so you have Hudson Oliver, for example, who won 4 championships. You have people like William Young, who played on that Low-End team alongside Cumberland Posey, who ended up eventually becoming the Secretary of Labor for the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania. You have a number of other stars like this. And so what we do is we advocate for their proper recognition by the Hall of Fame or by local halls of fame. And we've been pretty successful in working with them, and they have a special committee. And so we've had now 12 of these early forgotten pioneers enshrined as a result of their efforts.
Incredible. Great question from the audience. Brian, do you have another one there you want to give us?
Yeah, I do. So this is the relevant question based on what's happening in college sports right now. Was there ever a battle between amateurism and professionalism in the Black Fives era? And do you see any of the implications, certainly today in college sports?
Yes, I mean that debate actually started back then because the YMCA, which is the Young Men's Christian Association, invented the game under their auspices. So the idea of mind, body, spirit, which is their slogan, somehow being corrupted to be paid for the game that was supposed to be more of a spiritual wellness tool, was really the prospect of that was awful to the early authorities. Even Luther Gulick, who's the person who gave James Naismith the homework of inventing the game, was till his whole life, against professionalism. But what happened is that there was so much money coming in. If you think about it, if you have 3,000 patrons, even at 25 cents or 35 cents or 50 cents a piece, you start doing the math, and 4-bedroom apartment in New York City was only $25. So that's 3,000 patrons per game. And now all of a sudden you're playing 150 games. And so the best basketball managers started realizing we're going to be the more popular, the better we are, the more popular we are, and the more crowds want to come see us. And the only way to become better is if we import players and pay them. And Cumberland Posey was one of the first pioneers of that, but so was Robert Bob Douglas, who's in the Hall of Fame, and other of these early pioneers. Even on the cover, Will Anthony Madden, in 1920, he wrote an essay called The Future of Basketball, which predicted NIL, in effect, because he literally said, there's no way to keep money out of it if you want to have a good team.
Yeah.
Because the only way to have a good team is to pay players. And so there's no way to separate that or somehow try to control it because the floodgates there's too much pressure. And he was way ahead of his time in 1920, but it all came true eventually.
Yeah, great stuff. I want to ask you 2 wrap-up questions as we get toward the end of our fascinating discussion, but I want to make sure we don't finish this program without me asking you about the motto of your Black Fives Foundation, which you mentioned earlier, which is Make History Now. So can you explain to the students and others watching what you mean by that, how you make all that relevant today, and I see that patch on your jacket. What is the relevance of your cool jacket that you're wearing today?
Hey, thank you. I appreciate it. Well, Make History Now has 2 meanings. The first one that struck me from the very beginning was, how do we make this history cool somehow? Because I have these 3 kids and they're active, engaging, curious. But sometimes the topic of history is like, so what? It happened. Why are we even looking at this? It's a thick book. Who's going to read it? And so I really strove to make that history relevant. And one way to make it relevant, because of my background at the NBA and licensing, is through merchandise. Because in our communities and elsewhere throughout America, really the world, logos and merchandise and fashion is a way of speaking to one another. It's a way of acknowledging one another. It's also a way of saying, this is what I stand for. And so at the very beginning, I started by trademarking the logos of all these teams when I discovered them, including the New York Rens. And why is that important? It's because then we can control and curate and protect the history, preserve the history. Our mission is research, preserve, showcase, teach, and honor. And we always felt like if we don't do that, then the story can be told any which way. And it's too important. And the descendants that we're in touch with, like Mr. Baker, it's too important to them. And so that's part of it. And then the other meaning is that Make History Now focuses on right now. So the quality of what you put into this moment is directly going to impact the future trajectory of what this moment ends up creating. So if you're in basketball, it's not just on the court. You have to focus on this possession. You can't worry about, did you just miss a shot? You can't worry about, if we win this game, we get to play this other game. And same thing, you're in the practice facility, you're doing that rep, you're doing that drill, you're doing that one other additional free throw, whatever it is, to end on a make. That matters. And you don't just start that the day before a game. So whatever you did in that moment, you put your full all into that, it impacts the future trajectory. So we talk about Make History Now being, all right, pull yourself up, get it together, put all your grit, determination, and teamwork into right now, because you can only live right now. And so if you're always worried about the next moment, you can never think about this moment. So that's where that Make History Now comes from.
Yeah, and that is just so super relevant, as Brian can attest to what the mission of this Commission on Racial Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion of the Atlantic 10 is all about. Because as we sit in our commission meetings with members of the commission from every one of these 15 universities that are participating today, the message coming through loud and clear is we want to get some stuff done. This isn't just about talking. We want to get some stuff done. And it's beautiful. Last night I was at our women's game and saw some of the women warming up with shirts on for Black History Month. That's something we talked about. You know, we want visible, we want some action and things happening. We want to educate. We want to have action now instead of just postponing things. And so it's a really relevant message, I think, to be communicating to our students. And so I guess my last question, Claude, is there a movie in the future? Because I look at this and I say, this would be perfect for some kind of a film.
I am crossing my fingers because in the past we've had discussions about documentary, motion picture, as well as scripted series, and right now those are just discussions, nothing tangible yet. You know, we generally just realize, like, our slogan kind of at home is nothing happened yet. So again, Make History Now, but also we are always open and continue to talk and have discussions about that, because it would be tremendous. This book especially, because it's parallel stories, could lend itself really nicely to a scripted series.
Well, don't forget, Claude, that Sylvester Stallone, before he signed the movie deal for Rocky, insisted that he got to be Rocky. So who are you going to be in the movie?
Oh, man. I'd have to think about that. There's probably some cameo appearance somewhere where I could probably fit in the background.
Well, I just want to say this has been a fabulous gathering today. So I want to thank so much Claude. Thanks to my A10 co-chair, Brian Baptiste, for joining us for this important conversation today. A special thanks to Bernadette McGlade, our A10 commissioner, along with Jill Redman, Executive Senior Associate Commissioner of the A10. who helped to organize this program today, did a lot for us, so we appreciate it. Jill, as well as to the hardworking members of our commission. They get together all the time for our meetings, Brian, as you know, and they work harder than any group I've ever seen. And finally, to all of you who are tuning in to join us via live stream, I am so proud that Duquesne University is able to host such an important collaborative event like this with all of our A10 university partners. We set out in the beginning, as you know, Brian, to make this something that spanned all 15 universities, not just student athletes, but even broader than that. And that's exactly what today's program is carrying forward. So we look forward to continued collaboration with all 15 of our member schools as the Commission on Racial Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion moves forward with its important work going beyond words to achieve meaningful knowledge and action and make history now. So thank you. Best wishes for a fabulous spring semester and for a successful athletic season on all of your campuses. And thank you, Claude.
You're welcome. Thank you very much for having me. It's been a
Thank you,
pleasure.
Brian.